Mikhail Gorbachev in the city of the popes and the Caesars, bidding for peace between the Soviet Empire and the Kingdom of God. This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting tonight from St. Peter's Square in front of beautiful St. Peter's Basilica. Good evening. Mikhail Gorbachev huddled with Italian leaders today, strengthening his links with the West in advance of his meeting with Pope John Paul tomorrow and his first summit with George Bush this weekend. President Bush left Washington for Malta and the summit at sea, while Gorbachev's Italian visit built toward its climax tomorrow here at the Vatican, the first meeting ever between a Soviet leader and a pope. One Italian newspaper this morning called it Gorbachev's Roman conquest. But the Soviet leader is getting more than just friendly crowds and a positive press. The real conquest comes in the political and economic ties he's developing in the West. Tonight, in the major speech of his Italian visit, Gorbachev laid out the theme for both his upcoming meetings. He said the Soviet Union is committed to its own system, but needs the ideas and values of the West.
We no longer think that we are the best and that we are always right, while those who disagree with us are our enemies.
In Washington, as he left for the summit, President Bush sounded the same theme.
I believe the people of Europe can see that Mr. Gorbachev and I, East and West, are not in some kind of competition. Rather, we're both working to make the world a more peaceful one.
Earlier, Gorbachev and Italian Prime Minister Andreotti signed a joint statement saying a curtain of mistrust between East and West is coming down, spurred by the democratic changes in Eastern Europe. And their foreign ministers signed a raft of agreements for cooperation in business, trade, law enforcement, culture, and the environment. Gorbachev's triumphs abroad have come in stark contrast to his problems at home. In an encounter with a Soviet reporter today, Gorbachev made a point of defending his program of restructuring.
What we are doing inside the country must result in the final analysis in a better life in our country, not only in terms of greater freedom and democracy, but also better living standards.
Being pictured with the Pope tomorrow is another move aimed not just at the world outside, but at Gorbachev's own domestic audience. CBS News has been told the Pope is prepared to agree in principle to visit the Soviet Union, provided Gorbachev continues improving the general conditions for religion and moral revival, and grants specifics, such as allowing the opening of new dioceses, the naming of new Catholic bishops, and establishing diplomatic relations with the Vatican. Tonight, Gorbachev said the moral values which religion generated and embodied for centuries can help in the work of renewal in our country. Nowhere are these events in Rome and the Vatican being watched more closely than in Poland. It's the nation leading the way to political freedom in Eastern Europe, and it is, of course, home of the Pope, who is helping to forge a new relationship between communism and Christianity. From Poland, Bert Quint reports.
Here, where John Paul was born and baptized, people have a deep feeling of pride that the leader of world communism is paying a pilgrimage to their Pope. But even during the darkest days of communist repression, says a priest who was ordained with John Paul, we all drew strength from his constant support. The Solidarity leader in the Pope's hometown in southern Poland points to a crucifix and says, "This is what kept us going despite the water cannons and the prisons." We were bitter at first because John Paul left us for Rome, he admits, but it was God's design, and the Pope's every utterance was an inspiration and a comfort. And far away, in a desolate village in northeastern Poland, a family living on the edge of poverty, gathered in the warmth of a few last chunks of coal, talks of John Paul and Mikhail Gorbachev. They will meet, and this is a victory for our church, Helena Kowalska believes. The misery of millions in a country that communism bankrupted keeps people here from savoring that victory fully. As winter strikes early and savagely, they shiver on lines that, unlike communism, appear endless, trying to buy things they can barely afford. But seeing Gorbachev in Italy for his momentous meeting with the Pope seems to warm the Polish soul. We have so many problems just getting by, this woman says, that we don't think much about what's happening. But one day we will realize what an historic moment this is. As communist icons tumble, like this one of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the Pole who founded the Soviet secret police, people here feel that their own icons, which have weathered centuries of oppression, are more firmly planted than ever. And Poles see tomorrow's meeting of the Vicar of Christ with the head of a movement that tried to bury Christianity as the ultimate vindication of their faith. Bert Quint, CBS News, Warsaw.
Joining me now is CBS News Moscow correspondent Barry Peterson and the deputy director of the Kremlin's Institute on the United States, Sergei Plekhanov. They've been, of course, following Mikhail Gorbachev's pilgrimage to Rome and Malta. Gentlemen, in his speech tonight, Gorbachev talked about the need for an all-European summit conference next year, a kind of healing session aimed at creating what Gorbachev calls the common European house. Question, just how significant is this, Sergei?
I think it's a very timely suggestion. The Cold War is over, or is ending right before our own eyes, and that means that Europe is going to be much less divided, much less armed, and much more interdependent and friendly, with more trade and friendship between various European states. So it's time for the Europeans, East and West, for the Americans and the Canadians to sit down at the table and discuss the future of Europe in these new circumstances.
Barry?
I think what we should think about is what is not going to happen if this takes place. And I think Gorbachev has made it clear that one issue he doesn't want to discuss is redrawing the boundaries of Europe. And I think that says no reunification between West Germany and East Germany. I think he's been clear and concise on that point. And I applaud him, as I always have to applaud Mikhail Gorbachev, because he did it again. He stole the march on George Bush. He's come up with a dramatic proposal. He's done it in a public way, and off we go again. The Americans have to respond.
Sergei, isn't Gorbachev going to face criticism, at least in Western Europe, that, well, there he goes again trying to wedge America's European allies?
No, I don't think so, because Americans are invited, the Canadians are invited, and I'm sure that he will be discussing the same thing with George Bush in 2 days' time.
Now, he also spoke, Gorbachev, about moral values and their value to the Soviet Union. What's that about?
Well, I think that the moral factor is perhaps the crucial factor now for the success of perestroika. It's not so much the economic success, it's what people think about their own future, how they size up the changes that are taking place. And for that, we need a real moral renewal, because in the times of stagnation, there haven't been really much in terms of moral content in our lives.
Barry, what are the chances he's positioning himself for his conversations with the Pope by this talk of moral values?
I think he's done that very much. I think he's trying to say to the Pope, listen, communism and Catholicism, we really have a lot in common. Kind of an astonishing thought if you think about it. And let me go back to something Sergei said about a moral call to perestroika. I see in this a bit of desperation. The fact of the matter is the economic call to perestroika has basically flopped to this point. And I think Gorbachev is trying to rally his people behind a new banner. Maybe it says the same thing, but in some way generate the enthusiasm he knows he's losing.
Barry, Sergei, thank you. Still to come, we'll have the rest of the day's news, including an ongoing coup attempt in the Philippines and more from here in Rome on the confrontation of communism and religion. God and Gorbachev. Philippine Army rebels trying to overthrow the government of Corazon Aquino have bombed the presidential palace. Mrs. Aquino is reported to be safe. This is the 7th coup attempt against her in 6 years, and CBS newsman Gabby Tabernar says it began early Friday morning, Manila time.
Rebel troops moved a little past midnight, suddenly appearing at the gate of Villamor Air Base just outside Manila. The guards, taken by surprise, did not resist. Later, the rebels claimed they had taken over the headquarters of the Philippine Air Force Base. At the same time, other rebel troops occupied the government TV station as well as a private television station nearby. Government soldiers guarding the compound moved out. Later tonight, propeller planes dropped bombs on the presidential palace. There was no word on casualties. Meantime, heavy gunfire was heard near the presidential palace. Major avenues were sealed off, especially those leading to the presidential palace. President Corazon Aquino was meeting there with top officials after news of the mutiny was confirmed. Mrs. Aquino later went on nationwide television.
As President and Commander-in-Chief, I call on our people and soldiers to rally to the cause of freedom with determination and courage.
Rebel soldiers would not say who their leader was, but it was believed they were loyal to former Lieutenant Colonel Gregorio Honasan, who led the failed August 1987 coup attempt in which at least 53 people were killed.
Gabby Tabinor is up with us now, live by telephone Manila through Rome. Gabby, tell us what you know about the bombing of the presidential palace.
Well, early this morning, Manila time, two T-28 aircraft, these are the World War II vintage trainer planes converted by the Philippine Air Force to attack planes, bombed the presidential palace. They circled twice over the palace. No report of damages have yet been received, but a radio station reporting from the palace said 3 people were killed. That's still unconfirmed. But planes are being used to strafe also not only the palace, but the government radio station, which was occupied by the rebels.
Gabby Tabinor, live in Manila, covering a confusing and still developing situation. Leftist rebels in El Salvador held their fire for a few hours today. That allowed hundreds of U.S. citizens to flee the country for the safety of home. CBS News Defense Department correspondent David Martin reports on the voluntary evacuation.
Armed U.S. soldiers were out in the streets as the Salvadoran army tried to chase off an estimated 50 to 100 rebels who had pinned Americans down in their homes. More than 200 Americans, most of them families of embassy employees, left El Salvador today after the rebels called a temporary truce. The first plane load of Americans arrived outside Washington this evening.
There was a lot of shooting, they were fighting. We were not targets, but we were in neighborhoods where there was fighting going on.
U.S. officials, who for the last 2 weeks have been describing the rebel offensive as a desperate last gasp, acknowledge that the rebels have scored a propaganda victory by forcing Americans to leave. But they claim it will be short-lived.
Our embassy is open, and we would note that this authorized departure from post is again temporary and covers a period of 30 days.
Today, at an emergency session of the Organization of American States, a Salvadoran diplomat displayed a Soviet-made anti-aircraft missile allegedly shipped to the rebels through Nicaragua. But a Soviet official issued a blanket denial on behalf of the Kremlin and its Latin American clients.
We're not supplying Nicaragua with armaments now, and we are not supplying rebels with armaments, and we understand that Nicaragua and Cuba are not supplying rebels with armaments.
U.S. officials continue to insist the rebel offensive has failed to achieve its primary objective of igniting a popular uprising. But these same officials also expect the rebels to continue their hit-and-run attacks in an effort to prove they remain a force to be reckoned with. David Martin, CBS News, the Pentagon.
Another accused cocaine criminal wanted in the United States was extradited by Colombia today. Jorge Mario de la Cuesta is charged in Florida with conspiracy to smuggle 16 tons of cocaine. He's the 9th Colombian drug thug turned over to the United States since August. Terrorists in West Germany killed that country's most powerful banker today. An armor-plated automobile carrying Alfred Herrhausen was blown apart by a remote-controlled bomb just outside Frankfurt. Herrhausen was chairman of Deutsche Bank and a top advisor to Chancellor Kohl. The ultra-leftist Red Army faction claimed responsibility for the attack. In Washington, President Bush has vetoed a bill that would have made it easier for Chinese students fearing persecution back in China to remain in the United States. Bruce Morton has late details on that.
Just before leaving for a summit where he'll talk up democracy in Eastern Europe, the president delivered what critics say is a blow to the democracy movement in China.
Dear Mr. President,
despite pleas this week from Chinese students, Mr. Bush vetoed a bill which would have allowed them to stay here instead of going home to a government which might arrest and kill some of them for their pro-democracy activity.
People have the fear that one day, or sooner or later, they will be forced back, and the Chinese government will get them.
The bill had passed the House unanimously, 403 to nothing.
The presidential veto is one that was signed by President Bush, but his hand was guided by Deng Xiaoping.
The bill passed the Senate on a voice vote with support from liberals like Kennedy of Massachusetts and conservatives like Hatch of Utah. But the Chinese government protested to the president and said passage would worsen relations between Washington and Beijing. In his veto message, the president, by executive order, waived the requirement that the students return to China, saying that offered them the same protection as the vetoed bill.
Under current law, the president already has the authority to provide necessary relief for Chinese students and others who are concerned about returning to China under present circumstances.
The students would have preferred the security of a law and say the veto limits their ability to speak out for democracy. Bruce Morton, CBS News, Washington.
How do orange juice, tomato juice, and grapefruit juice measure up to prune juice?
The anti-religious persecution that is just now beginning to recede in the Eastern Bloc, of course, is only one of many historic persecutions that faith in God has survived. Right here in the city of the popes stand the ruins of the Colosseum, where Roman emperors threw Christians to the lions. The Christians survived to convert the Romans. And today, in the Soviet Union, the Christian faith that has survived decades of communist persecution is surging back. From Soviet Lithuania, Peter Van Sant has a report.
Religious education in Lithuania is back in business. For the first time in 50 years, this Catholic seminary in Kaunas is bustling. 160 students pack its classrooms. A year ago, there were just 25.
When some freedom is allowed, more and more young people come.
Romas Galiauskas is among the pioneers exploring Mikhail Gorbachev's religious tolerance, seeking the priesthood in an officially atheistic state. I don't think the state can do without the church. The church plays a very important role in the moral education of its people. Work has begun to reclaim decades of religious desecration. This church had become a museum of atheism during Khrushchev's reign. It is now being turned back into a church at cost paid by the Soviet government. It's a question of justice, says this official. Within a year, there will be people praying here. Amid the optimism, these seminarians know that the religious freedom they have been given can just as easily be taken away. The church has started a crusade for the good, and in a crusade for the good, the church must be prepared for the worst times. Lithuanians are working quickly to restore what had been destroyed during 50 years of repression, reminding all that for now, Christianity has triumphed. Peter Van Sant, CBS News, Soviet Lithuania.
I'll be back with more from Rome in a moment on the story of communism and religion, faith and the empire. Tomorrow's meeting between Pope John Paul and Gorbachev is another landmark in the voluminous history of Rome. But it doesn't just come out of the blue. It's the climax of a process that has gone on for years. The Vatican's reaching out to communist countries of the East, the Soviets rolling back their persecution of religion. To get some perspective on this stretch of history, we went to two men who have fought that persecution for years. Elie Wiesel, the Nobel Prize winner, who has championed the cause of rights for Soviet Jews, and the Christian evangelist Reverend Billy Graham. I asked them what they expect from tomorrow's meeting.
I think that they're going to talk about the possibility of the Pope going to the Soviet Union. And of course that would be a unique thing and could be a catalyst for something even greater than we're seeing now, if that did happen.
Could Gorbachev allow that to happen? Could he afford to gamble with that?
At the present time, I don't think so, but I'm not sure. I think that it would be a tremendous thing for the Soviet Union because the people in the Soviet Union believe in God probably more than any people in the world. And you see that in the attendance that is going up very high in the Orthodox churches and in the other churches as well, and the vast changes in religion that are taking place that I've seen just in the trips I've made there.
Candid opinion, is the Pope being used by Gorbachev?
Perhaps they're using each other. And my money would be on the Pope.
What about those who say, listen, we're all being taken in by Gorbachev. He is at core still a Marxist, Leninist, Stalinist, who's going through a bad period and is simply fighting for time?
Who knows? It's quite possible. After all, Gorbachev isn't a saint either. He was the number 2 man under Yuri Andropov in the KGB. The man who climbed the ladder of the KGB to become the number 2 man is not a saint, cannot be. So I understand the concerns and the hesitations, even the doubts. But we have a choice. Either to say that he has bad intentions, but his deeds are good, or the reverse. And I prefer the first option.
Why?
Because practically he's helping us. Practically he's giving freedom. Practically he has opened the gates to hundreds and thousands of Jews who want to leave the Soviet Union and dissidents. After all, we have now a freedom. Anyone who applies for a visa now in the Soviet Union is no longer punished. He or she can still have his or her work, and his or her place in society is not jeopardized. Before, it was impossible.
Can he survive for very long inside the Soviet Union?
I fear for his future, and I fear for his health. I fear for his safety. I must tell you, if anyone had told me 25 or 30 years ago that I will pray for the health and the life of a Soviet leader, I would have laughed at his face. But I do.
When you see the television pictures of Gorbachev meeting the Pope, what's likely to be going through your head and heart?
Our prayer for both of them, that they won't make any mistake that would affect what is going on now.
And that's part of our world tonight. Dan Rather reporting from the Roman Colosseum. Later tonight, I'll be around with a special edition of 48 Hours, concentrating on the people behind these revolutionary upheavals in Eastern Europe. Tomorrow, we'll be broadcasting from Malta, scene of the Bush-Gorbachev summit. From Rome, good night.
Shakes and the walls come tumbling down. What will the next 48 hours be like? The heroes behind the headlines tonight.
This is CBS.
And just ahead on